sequence of events in Earth's history. And establishing a time frame like this is an important part of telling the story of the history of the Earth. So I'll be reviewing 5 of the main principles of relative dating, and I'm going to start with the first, which is the principle of original horizontality. And this principle essentially states that layers of sediment are generally deposited in a horizontal position, as we see here in this cross section. And we can gather that rock layers that are flat, like those depicted here, have not been significantly disturbed. And this is important to acknowledge because when we see rocks that have been folded, as these have been here, or rocks that have been tilted, what we are seeing really is consequences of deformation, right? We're seeing the results of tectonic stress that has been applied to rock. And that's because we know rocks are not formed, they're not deposited, right, in tilted or folded layers as they are here. And whenever we see tilted layers, again, we know that that area must have been subject to some tectonic stress. The second principle of relative dating is the principle of superposition. And that simply states that in an undeformed sequence of sedimentary rocks, right, they could also be layered igneous rocks. In an undeformed sequence of rocks, the oldest rocks are on the bottom. Those are the rocks that were deposited first. And the rocks on top of those are younger, right? And we can apply this through a whole sequence of rocks where the oldest are on the bottom, the rocks become successively younger, and the youngest rocks, right? The youngest rocks are those on the very top. And a nice example of this is looking at a section, a wall in the Grand Canyon. This is a very common example. And we can see different layers of rock in this illustration. And the oldest rocks here of the region are right on the base. And as we move upward, right, it's as like we're walking through time. And each layer is an indication of past conditions in this area, right? So not only are the rocks becoming younger, but the rock types are changing. We have a shale that's overlain by a sandstone, that's overlain by a limestone. And what we're seeing here is a change in depositional setting in this area. The next principle of relative dating is the principle of cross-cutting relations. And that states that if one geologic feature cuts across another, the feature that has been cut is older. By feature, we're referring to either a fault, a break in the rock, or an igneous intrusion. So if we look at fault A here in this location to the left, you can see that this break in the rock has cut through the green layer, the orange, the purple, the tan, the yellow, and the brown layer. The fault has cut through all of these layers, and the principle of cross-cutting relationship would tell us that these layers must then be older than the fault. The fault is younger. Another way to think about it is that this break in the rock, it couldn't break the rock if the rock was not already there. So for the sequence of events in this area, we would say sediment for the green rock was deposited, then the orange rock, then the purple, then the tan, then the yellow, then the brown, and then we had tectonic stress, which resulted in a fault, a break in the rock and some movement. And this fault, which is a reverse fault, my hanging wall has been pushed up relative to my footwall, would indicate that the type of tectonic stress was compressional stress in this area. Dike A is an igneous intrusion that cuts through all of the layers here, and the principle of cross-cutting relations would indicate that Dike A is then the youngest of all these other rock layers and events. The next principle of relative dating is the principle of inclusions. An inclusion is a piece of rock that is enclosed within another rock, and the rock containing the inclusion is younger. Let's take a look at the example up here at the top of the page. We have host rock, right, which has experienced an upwelling of igneous rock into that host rock. And we can see the igneous rock now contains inclusions or pieces of the host rock. After some time, this area has undergone erosion, right? That is the middle figure here in this slide. And after this erosion, we have a change in environmental setting, and we're seeing the deposition of different sediments and sedimentary layers. And the bottom layer of sediment has inclusions of this igneous intrusion. And you can see those inclusions here, and it helps us understand that this igneous intrusion, right, is older. It existed here before this layer of sediment became rock because it includes some of this igneous body. The final principle of relative dating is the principle of fossil succession. And fossil, of course, is the remains or traces of prehistoric life. And the principle of fossil succession basically states that fossil organisms succeed one another in a very definite and determinable order. So any time period can be recognized by its fossil content. Now, there's lots of types of fossils, right? So we're talking about lots of different things that can be used here. But an important thing to keep in mind is that not every organism results in becoming a fossil. And there are certain conditions that are favorable for preserving remains of once living organisms. And essentially, we need to have conditions that allow for the rapid burial of organisms, and those organisms really need to have some sort of hard parts. But if you got these two variables together, you could very well create the conditions that would preserve a fossil, and these fossils become incredibly helpful in allowing us to establish some sort of timeline to our story. And you'll note here in this very simplified geologic timescale with fossils, assemblages here, that some fossil species existed for only a very short interval of time, right? And so when we find these species, which existed for a very short period of time, they're really very diagnostic of a particular period or epoch. So they become very important, and we usually refer to these types of species as index fossils. And so we utilize index fossils to, again, help us establish a timeline to our story. Determining the relative ages of rocks and events empowers geologists to easily unravel complicated geologic histories like the one that is shown here. In effort to tell the story of the events of what happened here, we start at the beginning. And again, rocks are deposited in a horizontal fashion, with the oldest on the bottom of a sequence of events. So here we would have rock unit 1 as being the oldest unit of rocks, overlain by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. 8 is the youngest unit of rocks in this illustration. Sometime later, we have the intrusion of an igneous body, right? This is an igneous sill. Now, we don't know exactly when this igneous sill intruded in regards to the deposition of layers 6, 7, and 8. But we know that the sill came in prior to compressional stress in this area, because this compressional stress essentially resulted in the folding of all of these layers, including this dark layer, which is our igneous sill. So the type of stress, again, that forms the large anticline and syncline depicted here is compressional stress. Sometime after my rocks have been folded here, we have the intrusion of this magma body. And this magma body has cut through these layers of rock, right? So the principle of cross-cutting relations would tell us that this magma body is younger than these layers. So after the deposition of 8, right, we had tectonic stress that folded these layers. And after that tectonic stress, we had the upwelling of this magma body. After the upwelling of the magma body and the solidification of that magma, we had tectonic stress that resulted in a fault, in a break in the rock and subsequent movement. This type of fault is a normal fault. We know that because our hanging wall has slumped down relative to our footwall, and that normal fault is the result of tensional stress on our rocks. So after we had the folding and the magma body, we had tensional stress, which resulted in this faulting. After we had this fault, we had the upwelling of another magma body, which reached the surface of the Earth. And in doing so, it cut through all of these rock layers, including my magma body and including my fault. So we know that the upwelling of this magma, which resulted in the formation of a volcano, must be younger. It must be younger because it cut through everything else. Sometime after the formation of this volcano, we had erosion to the entire landscape here. And the erosion actually removed the entire superficial feature of the volcano, right? So it cut right through that volcano and the dike. So utilizing all of the principles of relative dating together has really allowed us to establish a timeline here, right? And decipher a relatively complex sequence of events. I hope this was helpful. And in conclusion, again, applying these very simple principles of relative dating, they help us establish a timeline to our story. And this is important in interpreting the geologic history of an area.